In January, Governor Brown projected another partly cloudy state budget with a slight surplus, but April brought rain in the way of lower tax receipts and a May revision where the governor was warning that more financial clouds are forming. What is the state's financial situation? We'll ask. Mac Taylor, leader of the California Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, or LAO, and the authoritative voice on state fiscal matters. Chris Hoene with the California Budget and Policy Center, and Dan Walters, columnist with the Sacramento Bee. The 2016 May Revise. Governor Brown's Aesop Fable.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. In January, the governor presented his budget proposal to the legislature. Now that the governor's got a better picture of state revenues after the April taxes, he's proposed a revised budget. Is his newly revised budget prudent given the fiscal realities we're facing? That question is for our guest, Mac Taylor, the California's legislative analyst and the acknowledged authority on the state budget. Welcome.
Nice to be back, Mark.
So what's your overall impression of the state budget?
Well, the May revision, which is the time, as you said, when the budget is revised based on all of the knowledge that we gained from April payments from taxpayers, it's a rather quiet May revision. The revenues were down a little bit, and so you didn't have a lot of new proposals by the governor. So it's a little bit of a continuation of what he started in January, which was a fairly cautious approach, not wanting to make a lot of new commitments given the stage of the recovery that the state's economy is in.
That's been pretty steady with him all along. That's that approach of kind of don't overextend what you're offering.
I think he was very influenced by what happened when he came into office, the problems that the state went through.
You know, but unlike recent past, though, we did see a decrease in revenue projections this time. Usually they're going up. This time they went down. What's driving the new lower projections?
Yeah, first of all, let me put it in context. We're down about at $2 billion, but that's over the whole budget window, which encompasses 3 years.
Okay.
And on a budget of $120 billion, right. It's a lot of dollars, but it's not a huge proportion.
I know you throw $1 billion,
yeah,
it's not that much, but yeah,
on a
relatively
speaking.
Basis. Right.
Exactly. And the numbers are a little lower from what both the administration and my office projected in January, but frankly, it's not surprising because in the early part of the year, financial markets really sort of took a tumble. They've since regained those losses. And the first quarter was very soft in the economy as a whole. So it's not surprising that revenues were down a little bit.
Well, you know, the governor is not proposing much in the way of, you said, we have new major programs, but there were some significant previous budget commitments that will drive future costs that were baked into this budget. What were they?
I think probably the best example is the minimum wage increase that the state enacted recently, which will have a small effect in the coming fiscal year, which starts on July 1. But in out years, it will have a fairly significant effect.
It's not jumping to $15 an hour next year.
Over 5-6 years.
Right, but when it reaches that point, it's going to have a significant effect?
Billions of dollars in added costs to state government.
And why is that? Explain why that is.
Well, the state hires lots of people, not so much directly, but in the services that it provides, through healthcare services or various social services, and some of its own employees. So not only do private employers, will they have to pay more, the state will also.
Yeah. There's also those collective bargaining agreements they're going to have to negotiate, and those increases got to be paid.
And the first couple that we've seen have had multi-year increases, and so that accumulates over time also.
Yeah. So the governor's calling for an optional $2 billion deposit into the rainy day fund to boost the reserve to $8.5 billion. You said that's a smart move. You think that's a smart move. Why?
Well, we may have had some issues with the governor on where to put that $2 billion, but we think building reserves overall is really important for the state to do. If we follow the governor's plan, as you said, we'd have about $8.5 billion in total reserves, which is about 7%. And that's a pretty good target to shoot for. And what that does is obviously it protects you should we have an economic downturn. You don't have to make rapid adjustments in state spending. It buys you some time to make those adjustments more gradually.
You know, we a number of years ago when we were talking, they were talking about these $20 billion deficits. So $8.5 billion sounds like a pretty good reserve, but $20 billion deficit, that's going to get, eaten up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think people just have to remember that when you have a general fund revenue system that's so reliant on the personal income tax, which is very reliant on high income taxpayers and capital gains, You can have up and downs with enormous swings on a year-to-year basis.
But that kind of asks, there may not be an answer to this question, so I'll premise it that way, but what is the right amount to set aside? It's talking 7% of a reserve. Should it be 5%? Should it be 10%? Should it be more?
There is no right answer, and in part of it depends on how sort of risk-averse you are. So that if you're a legislator and you don't want to have to make any serious cuts should there be a downturn, you want a very big reserve. If you're more willing to sort of deal with some risk and make adjustments a little bit more on the fly, you can accommodate a smaller reserve. I think the legislature, in setting the target in Proposition 2, which the voters approved a couple of years ago, that set up our rainy day reserve, it set a target of 10%. I think that's a pretty good one to shoot for.
Yeah, the other thing you have to think about is when you have that money in the reserve, it means you're not spending it on programs that you kind of like. Everybody wants a road, or maybe some social services, or higher education, or K-12. That money's not, you can't spend it on that. It's in a reserve.
I've always talked about the 1-2 punch of reserves. It prevents you from making commitments that maybe you can't support during a downturn, and then it also creates that fund that buys you that time in the short run.
Right, right. So the governor has talked about this wall of debt, and I was wondering what makes up that wall of debt? Is it getting lower, and is the governor doing anything in this budget to deal with that problem?
The wall of debt refers to obligations that we incurred during our bad budget times related to the budget, short-term obligations where we borrowed from special funds, local governments, individuals. We've paid back most of that so-called wall of debt, and I think more people are concerned about retirement-related obligations, pensions, and retiree health care than they now are about the so-called wall of debt.
$70 billion liability.
Hundreds of billions in unfunded liabilities.
Right, okay. Well, up next, we're going to get into the weeds of the governor's current proposed budget. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Mac Taylor, California's legislative analyst and the recognized authority on the state budget. So the lack of affordable housing has been a big issue this year at the state capitol. What, if anything, does the governor's budget do to address that issue?
The governor has one very major proposal. It's not so much budget related, but it's a very significant proposal regarding housing. Basically, he would make it easier for multifamily housing projects to be approved at the local level. And what makes it so contentious is that local governments have historically been the entities that control the zoning and the development and the approval of local housing projects. And the governor,
a lot of NIMBYism going on sometimes.
Certainly in many cases, and so the governor's trying to say for certain projects that meet certain criteria, these should be on sort of a faster track for approval by local governments.
Now, I won't even get into the whole CEQA reform. We'll leave that aside for now. Let me ask you about education. Far and away the biggest part of the state budget. While we're seeing this kind of decrease in revenue estimates, we are seeing an increase in funding for K-12 through Prop 98's minimum guarantee. I think that confuses a lot of people. Can you explain that?
Not really, no.
Okay.
It's formula driven, and as you said, I think people that are familiar with Proposition 98, our school spending formula, generally speaking, when revenues go up, the minimum guarantee goes up, and conversely, when revenues fall, the minimum guarantee falls. There are so many formulas in 98, though, that you can get some odd year-to-year changes in revenues, the growth rates, and this was just one of those
years. Is it like a lag effect? I mean, they're doing it based on previous revenue?
A little bit. It's really because of the change in the revenue estimates that came in the May revision, and you had in effect an increase from this year, next year over this year. And it's just a very strange result of the formulas.
Someone said they described the whole formula to the Winchester Mystery House.
It can be a little bit like that, frankly, and it's very unintuitive. You never know what the formulas may kick out.
That's interesting. Anyway, let's talk about higher education. UC and CSU, how do they fare in the governor's budget?
Well, no big changes in the May revision, but the budget overall, both segments received 4% increases, which was in line with a sort of an arrangement that's been in place for the last 2 or 3 years. In addition, the University of California got a large payment for its retirement system, and the governor did have a $25 million increase for the California State University system to try to deal with the issue of graduation rates.
A few strings attached there, right?
Well, they have to come out with a plan, and it has to be approved by the administration, but that was one new proposal that came out in the May revision.
Yeah, I was looking at some numbers that are saying that Cal State graduates in 4 years is something like 19-20%, very low number in 4 years. Better in 6 years, but the 4 years, the typical college experience that a lot of, I think, parents probably went through, their kids are not having the same experience. And a lot of that is because of lack of class opportunities and things of that nature. Let me ask you about income inequality. What does the budget do? What does the governor do in his budget to address such things as, minimum wage, earned income tax credit, those kinds of things that get to this income inequality issue?
Well, I'm not sure there's a lot new, but again, we've already touched on things that have occurred recently. Last year, the state passed an earned income tax credit, which is geared towards very low-income workers. And of course, with the minimum wage increase, will affect a lot of low-income workers. But I think while there's not a lot of new proposals, I think it's important to remember that much of the state budget is geared towards making payments to low-income people, whether it's our Medi-Cal health program or even in our schools. We have added payments that are based on the number of low-income kids that you have.
Referred to as the local control funding formula.
Exactly. So while there may not be a lot of new things outside of what's recently done, the whole state budget in many ways is geared around providing those type of opportunities.
You know, that earned income tax credit in particular is kind of interesting. People say that's a pretty good way to approach the issue of income inequality, encourages people to work, gives them lower income people a break. But it seemed like this last year, not a lot of people signed up for it in April. In fact, my understanding is only about $295 million was spent on that cost the state treasury, but they were projecting $380 million expense. So I think the question there is getting the word out, right?
I think so, and I think the legislature has been concerned about and has considered some augmentations just to do exactly that. You have to remember that people who need to claim the credit or are eligible to claim the credit typically don't file state income taxes because they don't have liability. They file, in effect, get a refund check. Right. So if they're not used to being engaged in the system, it may take that kind of education to
they actually
make them aware.
A great point. They said that 57,000 households claimed this credit, had not previously filed a California tax return, so quite a few people. Let me ask you about these social programs for the poor, the disabled, and children. Is the governor making any changes there? Anything really to talk about?
I would say nothing really large. He does propose a small grant increase for the senior disabled. But a lot of our social service programs, even though there's not a lot of policy changes, they still can grow in cost just because increased utilization, increased caseload, more people applying for the programs. And the governor's budget fully funds those type of caseload increases.
Last question, crime. It's always a big issue.
Yeah.
What's the governor's budget do to address the issue of crime?
You know, there's not a lot direct in the budget. He has, in the May revision, a $25 million increase to our state prisons to increase rehabilitation programs. But I think for your viewers, the interesting thing is going to be in November, where there's lots of initiative measures, haven't yet qualified, but you could have 2 on the death penalty, 1 on the governor's sentencing proposal, and another one on firearms ammunition. So I think that's where you're going to see the ballgame.
Okay, that's great. Well, I want to thank our guest, Mac Taylor. Up next, let's get political about the state budget. What do key political observers think about the governor's budget? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Our guests are 2 political observers of the state budget. Chris Hoene with the California Budget and Policy Center. He's the executive director. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Dan Walters. He's been here often, a columnist that a lot of people read with the Sacramento Bee.
I'm in a rut or something.
We're glad to have you back. Actually, you've been on as well, Chris. Well, let's talk about the state budget. So, Chris, what's your general take?
I think it's a budget proposal that looks a lot like what the governor's views of the world are. It's framed by his assumption that the tax increases passed by voters in 2012 will expire as they're scheduled to do. And in a world of uncertain economic times, he wants to build up the state's rainy day fund. And so when you assume those 2 things at the outset, there isn't a lot of room for anything else. There is room for negotiation, but the budget represents his view that there's not a lot of space.
Not a lot of wiggle room?
Yeah, basically he has that worldview, and a big factor is whether Prop 30, the temporary income tax, is extended. He says he's neutral, but then he says, but if we don't get it, we're going to have deficits. And it's the easiest tax to do because 99% of the people don't pay it, and so on and so forth. So in a way, probably he wishes it happens, but he doesn't want to be associated with it because he said it would be temporary. Right. So he's kind of playing that kind of word game, basically. But the really lurking thing is whether there's going to be another economic downturn sometime in the next couple, 3 years. He seems to think it's inevitable. He's more likely right than wrong because of the way the cycle works. There are some signs of slowdown in the economy. And if that happens, by his own numbers, he says state to get a $55 billion revenue loss in 3 years, and even if his rainy day fund is completely filled up, it's only $12 billion. So he doesn't want to go out on that note of having a deficit budget, obviously.
In the meantime, though, there are issues that they are talking about. The legislature have been talking about affordable housing quite a bit. Anything in the governor's budget on affordable housing? Is that one of those little areas?
Yeah, he actually has something, and it's not a money thing. It's a policy thing. He wants to fast track housing that meets certain categories, take it out of the realm of local politics, housing is low, affordable housing, near transit, that sort of thing. He wants to fast track it and take city councils and so forth out of the picture on that kind of housing. And it responds to a legislative analyst report that says basically, forget trying to build housing for certain categories, just build more housing,
right,
and the problem will take care of itself. And I think he's bought into that.
Not policy, but change in regulations and those kind. Not money, but rather changes in policies and regulations.
Right,
for
trying to streamline the process for building affordable housing that's already met certain categories of requirements. And he's also adopting a version of the Senate plan that would actually use some Proposition 63. This was passed in 2004. It's a surtax on high-income households
for the mentally
to build housing for homeless populations.
Okay.
So the combination of those two things sort of represent his housing.
In the capital, that's considered free money.
Right. Okay. Only in the capital. Well, Chris, let me ask you this. Another thing we've been talking about is transportation. There was a special session on that going back to last year. Nothing's happened. Still waiting. What do you think is going to happen here? Are the localities, like the cities and the counties, going to give up on state action? Just say, you know, if we don't have them, we're going to implement a self-help tax.
Well, I think in some ways they already are. If you look at what the November ballot is shaping up for at the local level, you're going to see a lot of local infrastructure measures, transportation, water, utility types of measures. And it's because the state's really not doing enough in this space. And it's a bit absurd that the state sort of is devolving the responsibility for infrastructure to local governments. The state needs to be in that space. And it's going to make for some hard choices, raising gas taxes, here again, finding revenues that will help subsidize and again, it represents the governor's views. If there isn't a revenue source and the money's not there, then there's no ongoing obligation.
Any comments on transportation?
Well, it's a tricky business because you have to have some Republican votes. It's any kind of tax increase would require at least a few Republican votes, and they're not there. And the Republicans have some leverage on that, and they've kind of hinted around they want some things in return to do that, such as changing union rules and state employment in the Department of Transportation, and that's a hard sell to Democrats. At the moment, I check in with the people who follow this, about once a week, and it's basically nothing yet.
Okay. Well, Dan, what about let's say Democrats, and they're wanting to see more social programs restored, to pre-recession levels for the poor, the disabled, the young, et cetera. Has the governor responded to that request in the budget?
He's responded with silence, basically.
Okay.
Early in his this second governorship, I asked him personally, I said, well, you made all these cuts in social services. You intend these to be just temporary because of the budget deficit? He said, they sound pretty permanent to me. He's never been known for his warm heart, shall we say, and particularly when it comes to social services, he's pretty much a skinflint on that thing. He gives ground occasionally, but he gives ground very grudgingly. And I think in the mode he's in right now, with this idea that he might leave office with a big budget deficit in the back of his head, he's going to be a tough sell on anything that increases significantly the spending level.
Chris, I'm going to ask you, we've only got about 30 seconds left in the segment, but I'm going to ask you about legislative Republicans. They want things too in the state budget. They want to see expanded dental benefits for Medi-Cal. They want to see some new tax breaks. Any chance that either one of those are going to happen?
Well, I think they could find some allies on the dental plan. In the Democrats who also want to see that, I think. It's sort of how it's packaged. Here again, if it's packaged...
It's about a $200 million proposal. So.
Right, but if it's packaged with things like a set of tax breaks that are also in the ask, it's probably unlikely to get a lot of attention.
Okay, well, up next, what do we do about the state's roller coaster revenue situation? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Another budget season and another surprise in revenue numbers. This time, they went down. So what should be done to deal with the state's volatile revenue structure? We're talking with Chris Hoene with the California Budget and Policy Center and Dan Walters with the Sacramento Bee. So Dan, I know you've written a lot on this, but everybody seems to understand that the tax system is too unstable the way it's currently set up, and it's probably unsustainable in the long term. What are the odds that the governor and the legislature are going to actually do something about this over the next 2 years?
0.
Do you want to elaborate?
You want more than that? It's a heavy lift. I mean, the problem with the budget is, from the standpoint of volatility, is we are utterly dependent on how well a handful of wealthy people, most of them in the San Francisco Bay Area, are doing in the stock markets and the other capital markets. The top 1% of taxpayers now pay half of the income taxes, which means they're paying a third of the entire general fund budget. That's about 150,000 people in the state of 39 million. And that's dangerous because their incomes go up and down a lot. Now, you don't have to be sympathetic with them, but the fact is that their incomes go up and down a lot, that almost irrespective of what the economy is doing.
Chris, what do you think?
Well, I think the question is how you solve it. There's no way we're going to get around the state having a somewhat volatile system. It's because the money is concentrated in a few hands, as Dan says. So the real question is what you do about that. If you make it not reliant on those folks' incomes, then you end up with less money and a system that taxes the poor more. Those aren't good outcomes. So the really good solutions are around broadening tax bases, closing loopholes, fixing
Value-added tax, there have been discussions about that.
Yeah, moving to something that's a better fit for the economy, undoing Proposition 13. But as Dan said, all of those are heavy lifts, and it's very unlikely people want to take those on.
Very heavy lifts. But let me ask you this, Dan. We were talking earlier about the temporary Prop 30 tax that's they're asking to be extended. The governor is ostensibly staying on the sidelines on this. What are the chances of it passing?
Chances are pretty good it's going to pass. As Jerry Brown says, the best tax is one that 99% of the voters don't pay, and this is certainly that category.
Because this would be for people making, what, over $250,000 a year?
And the polls indicate that it probably will pass. And in fact, it's interesting that the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors now wants to get state permission to put on their own so-called millionaires tax. So it's a popular way to tax, but it is kind of fiscally perilous to be so reliant on so few people. And what's the alternative? Well, you say closing loopholes, broadening it out, maybe broadening the sales tax to include services. There are a lot of ways it could be done, but
everybody's going to say, how does it hit me?
That's right. Yeah, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the fellow behind the tree, right? And so cigarette taxes are an easy thing to pass because only 15% of adults smoke in California, things like that. But it doesn't really get you there in terms of actually creating more stability in the revenue system. It's a heavy lift. You'd have to really, really overhaul the entire system. And when a state commission proposed to do that a few years ago, the report immediately went into the round file and was never seen again.
So the dustbin. Actually, Chris, I wanted to ask you about that cigarette tax. What's the likelihood of that passing? I'm guessing fairly high because, as Dan says, only about 50% of Californians smoke. Again, that is also something that's declining over time. And what about the e-vaping? Would that be included in such a tax?
Well, so I think if you look at the polling numbers, it's polling even better than the extension of the income tax increases. So it looks very likely that it'll pass. It only barely failed back in 2012 when a version of it was last put on. I think if
I think I was looking at the numbers last time. It was 49.8%.
Right, just by the slimmest of margins. And right now, it's polling with the latest PPIC poll, 67% of people are supporting it.
Pretty good start.
Yeah, it's a good start for a ballot measure. I think it will include e-vaping, maybe not right out of the box, but eventually, if you follow what's happened federally, the federal government's moving to include e-vaping in the way that it regulates tobacco and related products. So maybe not right out of the box, but I think it'll include it eventually.
And it will not that tax, but it will also be taxing marijuana.
I was just going to ask you about that. It's a great segue. So what do you think the revenue portion of that whole marijuana issue, how big a role is that going to play in the debate?
It's going to be a role, but it's not a lot of money. They figure about $1 billion a year is what you could realize from taxing marijuana.
Not a lot of money, only $1 billion a year.
Well, as Everett Dirksen said, it's $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon it adds up to real money. But it's in the scheme of things, $1 billion is not very much money. It's not the big lift on taxes that would be required. And you talked about maybe rearranging $20 or $30 billion worth of taxes to get some stability in the state's revenue system, and that's probably not going to happen.
Well, I want to thank our guests, Dan Walters with the Sacramento Bee and Chris Hoene with the California Budget and Policy Center, as well as Mac Taylor, California's legislative analyst for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or look us up on our website and follow the Maddy Daily, a daily e-newsletter on Valley politics. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.